I originally gave this presentation to the Five Cities Orchid Society on Thursday, July 11th, 2024. Unfortunately, I had some internet connection problems and cut out quite frequently. So my apologies for those of you who saw it during the original presentation a few weeks ago. I'm re-recording this and hopefully the quality will be better and you'll have a little easier time with the information I'm about to present. So my name's Ed Lysick. I grow my orchids in Templeton, California, about 8 miles from the coast. I'm up at an altitude of about 1,600 feet, which does create a fairly unique environment for growing orchids. And I've been growing orchids for 40 years now. And I thought when I developed this presentation, it would be a good idea if I could share some of the recommendations I've received from other orchid growers, as well as Five City Orchid Society members over the last few years that's helped me become a better orchid grower. I was a pretty rank novice when I started growing orchids, killed quite a few plants, and if you can learn by some of my mistakes and some of the recommendations that I've been provided, I think you'll do a lot better in growing your orchids and keeping them out of the compost pile. So let's get started. First off, there are 30,000 orchid species, 300,000 or probably much more registered hybrids. So where do you start? You're going to start a collection of orchids. You want to grow them with your particular growing conditions. How do you choose among these 300,000 to 400,000 orchids? Well, first let's think about where you want to grow your orchids. Greenhouse, maybe a covered patio. I know a number of people on the Central Coast and Five Cities Orchid Society members grow them outdoors in garden spaces, under trellises. And then we've always been dealing mainly with greenhouse growers, outdoor growers. We've heard from a lot of windowsill growers that they'd like some information and recommendations of what grows best under windowsill and indoor growing conditions. So I'll try to address that particular growing area as part of this presentation. So first off, my growing areas. I do have a fairly nice greenhouse. It's about 48 feet long, 16 feet wide, and it was built for me by a local builder, Andy Easterbrook, and I'm very happy with the way it turned out. I've started growing Phalaenopsis orchids on a windowsill. This has helped me understand a little bit more about the challenges and demands of orchid growing on windowsills. And then I also took the alleyway between my greenhouse and a barn structure where I keep my tractor, covered it with the dual glazed polycarbonate, which is the same glazing on my greenhouse. And it's provided a really nice frost-free environment to grow orchids between my greenhouse and the barn. And I do go in water regularly. And from the months of about May through late October, maybe early November, it's perfectly fine for growing orchids frost-free, and I'm sure there are a number of you who have outdoor locations where this kind of modification would be possible. And then I also have a vegetable garden. Back part of it is a little shady. It's under oak trees, and I find it's a great environment for growing Cymbidium orchids. So those are the 4 areas that I'm currently growing my orchids. Now, what conditions are we talking about when we talk about growing conditions? Well, the first obviously is light. You're not going to grow very much in the way of orchids or plants in general if you don't have some type of light. Temperature is important. Some of you listening to this presentation may experience temperatures well below freezing. I get a few frosty mornings in January, February. For the most part, I'm above freezing. Most of our members of Five Cities Orchid Society are along the coast in Central California, and they're lucky to not experience frost conditions at all. Water and humidity is critical. If you're in Florida, humidity averages maybe 85, 90% on some days. Louisiana, same thing. Here, Southern California, we've got Santa Ana winds. You can see the humidity drop down to single digits, and certainly when we get offshore breezes on the Central Coast, we can see humidity levels down around 10, 20%. And then at the end, I also want to address lifestyle. because it is important if you travel a lot, if you don't have time to spend with your orchids every day like some of us do, you want to think about how you can control your environment so you can go away for periods of time without your orchid collection suffering. So let's learn from a few of the mistakes that I made when I had my greenhouse built about 12, 13 years ago. I took all my Cymbidium orchids that were growing outside, moved them into my greenhouse, and it was too warm, particularly at night, and Cymbidiums requiring cool evenings as flower spikes developing. What happened was the next year I had almost no flowers. And so Cymbidiums in my greenhouse was not the greatest idea. Next, I took my Hawaiian-grown large-flowered Cattleyas that I've been growing in Southern California when I moved up to the Templeton area on the Central Coast. They all did terribly badly in the wintertime. The temperatures dropped to 38 degrees. I lost new growths, scale developed, and the plants basically expired. It was just too cold in the wintertime. I wasn't able to control the minimum nighttime temperatures. And then I had read articles that Phalaenopsis growing in Southeast Asia in the forest developed roots that could grow out 2 to 3 feet on tree branches. So I cut down a few old oak branches that I had growing on my property, mounted them in the greenhouse, and then put a little wad of sphagnum moss down, mounted a number of Phalaenopsis orchids, and thought, wow, I'm going to simulate jungle conditions. I'm going to have a Phalaenopsis looking like they've naturalized in my greenhouse. And within 2 weeks, they all died. Leaves turned yellow, they started falling off, and I was left with dead orchids. It was too bright, too dry, and too hot. I simply didn't understand the conditions that I was trying to grow these orchids under in my greenhouse. So let's take a look at the most important criteria for growing conditions, and that's light. On the left, you can see a very distinct shadow, probably 5,000 to 7,000 foot candles, extremely bright light. Here we're talking about Cymbidiums. They can take extremely bright light, particularly on coastal areas, but if you're inland and you get bright light, you're going to need shading 40 to 60% to keep the leaves from burning and getting sunburn. But if you have very bright conditions, you can always use shade cloth, reduce the light intensities, and grow pretty much any type of orchid. If your maximum light is like the center, which is probably 3,000 foot candles, where you just have diffuse shadows, but not really distinct sharp edges, now you can grow a big range or a large range of orchids. Miltonias come to mind, Miltonopsis, the pansy orchids, a number of orchids that will grow in medium light conditions. And then on the right, if you've got a shadow where you can barely determine the edges, you're now down into 1,000 or less foot candles. And here we're talking about growing Masdevallias and other shade-loving orchids. Typically, they like cooler conditions, so certainly if you're on the Central California coast, you can grow a whole range of orchids, which we'll explore in a little bit. But do take advantage if you've got these kind of conditions, cool temperatures, and very mild lighting conditions. And it's very easy to go online. This is courtesy of the Caneo Orchid Society in the northwestern part of Los Angeles. And you can see, once you determine what kind of lighting you have in your growing area, you can simply go to a chart like this, look to the left, and you can see the lowest light levels. Ludicea, which are the jewel orchids, Masdevallia, which was the orange orchid I just showed, and Miltonia, which is the pansy orchid, are really great for windowsill growers and outdoors in shady locations, particularly if your temperatures never get above 85. And one of the easiest things to do, and this was obvious after it was pointed out to me, is match the leaf type to the light levels. So if you've got very high light, you need to look and think about growing narrow, thin-leaved, which are sometimes referred to as terete, succulent-like orchids. And Macchiae is a very good example. Very thick, fleshy leaves, almost succulent-like, and they can take very high light levels. So mine are mounted higher in my greenhouse where they get fairly bright light. The flowers are very attractive, and these are just all around good bright light orchids for your growing conditions. If, on the other hand, you've got low light conditions, look for broad, flat, thin leaves like Stanhopeia embryi. And these leaves have broad light collecting surfaces, so in the forest canopy, when they're down low under the canopy, they can collect light and the orchids will thrive. And they do have some fairly exotic looking flowers. The scents are great. Stanhopeia embryi has a somewhat medicinal fragrance. If you find Stanhopeia oculata, that has a scent that is almost exactly like mint chocolate chip ice cream. So Stanhopeia oculata is one that if you have low light conditions, cool to warm growing conditions, I definitely recommend it. Flowers only last about a week, but boy, during that time, mint chocolate chip just reigns in your growing area. And I have to really thank Larry Verheulig, who sadly is no longer with us, but he was the one who pointed out to me the leaf types related to light levels. Again, very obvious after he told me, but it's really served as a good guide in selecting what orchids to grow for what lighting conditions. And then if you're going to be a windowsill grower, be very aware that orientation of the window is critical to the types of orchids you're going to grow. Northeast window is ideal for Phalaenopsis. If you're an African violet grower, a northeast window is ideal as well. So just orient. If you're in an inland area, areas that get very bright light and maybe warmer temperatures, you want to avoid southern and western exposure. Your orchids will simply cook. You can move them farther back from the window. You can use sheer curtains to shade them a bit. But boy, if you got a northern window, northeastern window, that's ideal for growing a full range of the low light orchids that were in the previous slide from the Conejo Society. And now, windowsill orchid growers, we typically focus on Phalaenopsis orchids because they're readily available, relatively low cost. I call them the Trader Joe's orchids, and if you're not familiar with them, that usually brings to mind what they look like. But you also got a choice of Paphiopedilums, mini-cats, Oncidiums, particularly a series called Twinkle. And they're part of the Dancing Lady orchids. Twinkle comes in yellow, white, and pink, small flowers, and they look great. And then the jewel orchids that I mentioned earlier. And then I've also found great success in growing orchids on windowsills and even in a greenhouse in trays filled with water with gravel in the bottom to keep the bottom of the pots suspended above the water, and the water provides humidity and some temperature regulation. And again, for new orchid growers, sometimes when I say Phalaenopsis or Paphiopedilums, you may not have a vision come to mind of what the heck is this guy talking about. So for first-time orchid growers new to the trade, and we've all been there at some point in our careers in growing orchids, I just want to give you a few examples. This is what we talk about for a Phalaenopsis or moth orchid. And you'll see these for sale at places like Trader Joe's, Home Depot, Lowe's. The Paphiopedilums are sometimes called slipper orchids, and that's because of the pouch or the lip shape. These tend to be terrestrial. You can plant them in bark perlite, and potting mixtures. They're one of the few orchids that like to be repotted. So repotting once a year actually benefits these orchids. And they're great windowsill growers, and they're low light. The mini Cattleya orchids, there's been a lot of breeding done to keep the flower size large and to make the plants small so they're suitable for windowsills. A good grower and breeder of the newer varieties of these is Sunset Valley Orchids down in Vista, California. And so sunsetvalleyorchids.com, you can take a look at their website, and Fred Clark has done some amazing things with some of the smaller mini Cattleyas and the compact Cattleyas. The Dancing Lady Twinkle series, this is the what the yellow flowered version looks like. You'll have spikes with 30 or 40 of these small yellow, white, or pink flowers, and you can see from my index finger, relatively small flowers. Plants are about a foot tall, but certainly just a great windowsill indoor grower. And then lastly, the jewel orchids. Fantastic plants for foliage, take very low light levels. Usually they'll have a spike maybe 6 to 8 inches high with nice white flowers, relatively small, but they're grown for the foliage, not for the flowers so much. But again, great windowsill and indoor growers, and even if you're growing under lights, consider the jewel orchids. And now I mentioned northern windows for indoor growers, but you can also take a look outside for northern exposure. And this is Chris Erler, one of our members of 5 Cities, and he takes huge advantage of growing his orchids next to his house and under a lath structure facing north. On the left, you have a Masdevallia, and on the right, a Masdevallia coccinea, and that's his electric meter. So you don't need to get fancy, but these plants grow well. They don't really take temperatures much above 80, 85 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you've got an outdoor growing area and it's frost-free and you can keep temperatures down 80 degrees or below, boy, you can grow some great orchids if you've got northern exposure. And again, here's Chris, another good example of some of the plants he's growing, northern exposure. In the center, this plant was originally grown by another one of our members, Ericalenda. It was offered for sale in our silent auction. Chris bought it, and it's blooming under his lath structure. And then lastly, on the right, Dendrobium kingianum. And this orchid will grow just about anywhere you have a frost-free location. I grow mine outdoors. Temperatures get up to 105. They get down to 28 degrees, and it still does fantastically well. So Dendrobium kingianum is something you need to look for. Relatively small plant, fragrant flowers, blooms January through March, suitable for mounting, growing in pots. I keep some in trays or saucers, pots rather, with saucers with water under them, and they grow well in all of those conditions. So I can't say enough about Dendrobium kingianum. Now let's talk a little bit about temperature and how do we know what the temperatures are. Now that we've explored, we know what our light levels are, how are we going to determine what our maximum and minimum temperatures are and how to control them? Well, thanks to our society president, Jeff Parham, for pointing me in the direction of Sensor Push. This device is available on Amazon for probably something like 65, 70 bucks. There is a version now that has a module that connects to the internet. So if your growing area is within your Wi-Fi range, you can actually download the program onto your iPhone or an iPad or laptop or desktop, and you can monitor through a computer program what's actually occurring in your greenhouse. And so the screen you'll see will show current conditions, and so you can monitor and you can actually set alerts so that if the temperature goes above or below a threshold that you've set, you'll get an alert. You can go out and see what's up with your greenhouse or your growing area, wherever you're growing. The nice thing is you can also switch to the day mode, and you can see, well, last night what was the lowest temperature, and this afternoon what was the highest temperature. And then more importantly, you can go to the month and the year and get an idea of, well, what are my seasonal highs, seasonal lows, and what are my averages like? And this becomes extremely useful when you're now trying to determine what orchids can I grow. There's going to be that ideal set of conditions. I like to call them the Goldilocks conditions, where things are just not too hot, not too cold. And by using Sensor Push, you can zero in on exactly where you need to exercise your control. So for example, my greenhouse 2 weekends ago or 3 weekends ago now, temperature got to 107.6. Intolerable for orchids. Luckily, you can see the peak was only for a brief period of time. But the goal for me is how in the world do I reduce the maximum temperature that occurred on here July 5th, 2024. And then in the wintertime, here's January 12th, my greenhouse went to 38.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Again, way too cold for a lot of the cattleyas that I want to grow. And unfortunately, you can see that low occurred or close to it on several days in January. So what we really want to do is we want to look at how do we maintain a Goldilocks zone, keep our temperatures below the maximums, and above the minimums. Maximums in summer, obviously, minimums in winter. But we want to try to manage our growing areas so that we stay in that Goldilocks zone as long as possible, because that's going to mean our orchids are experiencing ideal conditions. They're going to grow quicker and longer. You're going to get better blooms, and you're going to overall have a greater orchid collection, less prone to diseases, and just happier orchids. So for the hottest temperatures, a couple of strategies you can use. Misting and humidifiers. This is a floor-mounted humidifier in Chris Erler's greenhouse. It's got a little sensor. When the humidity goes low, it feeds water. I think this one has a little pan where you can fill it every few days, the reservoir. You can go semi-hydroponics, which is an interesting technique. I'll say a little bit more about that later under lifestyle. But that will provide a lot of moisture to your orchids, keep the root zone somewhat cool. I've mentioned trays of wet gravel. Another tactic I've used for things like vandas and other orchids that tend to have long trailing roots is to grow Spanish moss. And that's the photo in the top right. I wet the moss with a hose and sprayer every morning, and that whole zone with all the surface area and the wet moss stays much cooler and much more humid for a longer period of time. And I found my vandas, and that's a Rhynchostylus gigantea, are doing much, much better with the moss growing around the roots. The other thing you can do on the lower left, that's an interior view of my greenhouse where I have two fairly large ficus trees growing, is use plants to transpire and create your own rainforest environment. They add mass, they add shading, and because of transpiration, they're constantly pumping humid, moist air into the greenhouse. So you water them, the root zone is wet, and then it manually is basically a misting system for you and pumping humidity into the air in your greenhouse. And then the old excuse, if you've got a spouse that says, geez, do you need another orchid? Don't you have enough already? Which we sometimes encounter in our family situations. Adding more plants and increasing the density of plants, if you can maintain air circulation, the more plants you have, again, the more transpiration, the more humidity, the more you can create a better growing environment rather than things widely spaced out. And so I've used that to my advantage, and some would say my greenhouse is a little overcrowded, but I say it's a better way of controlling my environment. Now, the other option you have is shading your greenhouse. Again, I use not only my ficus trees, but I use aluminized netting shade cloth of about 40% at the top of my greenhouse panels to reduce and diffuse light. A lot of ventilation, if you can improve ventilation, particularly if you've got higher ridge vents in a greenhouse, if you can then create pathways for air to come in low in your greenhouse. I have vents close to the floor. You get this chimney effect. Cool air comes in at the bottom, exits the top, and that will keep your greenhouse cooler. Certainly swamp coolers are a good option. If you're in fairly warm interior conditions, I should say in non-coastal instead of interior. They're a little difficult to install. They do need electrical hookups, water hookups, maintenance to control algae. But if you can hook a swamp cooler up to a greenhouse, you're really going to drop the temperatures and do nicely. I have a misting system. I collect a lot of rainwater and pump it into my greenhouse. And so I'll show you just a quick video of what it looks like. And so my misting system will kick on every 2 hours for about 1 minute and flood the greenhouse. It keeps the floor damp. Within 2 hours on hot sunny days, the greenhouse floor is almost dry, and then the misting comes on again. So I'm constantly pumping humidity and moisture into the area. I'm wetting root areas, and I keep the misting system on just during daylight hours so I don't get too much moisture at night. And boy, it's just a great way to reduce the temperatures in my greenhouse, particularly on those hot summer days. Had I not been out traveling on July 5th, I would have been able to activate the mist system more frequently and avoided that 107-degree peak. But unfortunately, I was away during that day. And a lot of people have asked, well, what kind of controller do you have on your misting system? And it's a kind of a strange name, but it's ART-DNE. And the top dial sets how long you want the system to stay on. And there it's set for more than I usually do. That's between 60 seconds and 10 minutes. So that would be about on for 5 minutes. The bottom dial is how often do you want it to go on. And so that would be every 60 minutes, it will kick on for about 5 minutes. And again, usually I set it for every 2 hours to come on for about 45 to 60 seconds. And the little three-way switch on the left is set to both. I just keep it for a day. And you'll have a solenoid valve in your misting system. You plug that into the ART-DNE. The ART-DNE goes into the electric outlet, and boom, you got an automated misting system. Another thing I wanted to emphasize, and this really surprised me, when I started talking about putting trays of gravel with water in the greenhouse, I started using net pots inside clay pots and put those so the bottom of the clay pot just touches the water level in the water-filled tray. And I wanted to see what the difference in leaf temperatures was in my greenhouse. So I have a Cattleya Betty Ford that's above the tray of gravel on a cinder block, and it read 88 degrees Fahrenheit. I then took a look at the Mazda hybrid, and surprisingly, and it's just about a foot below the Cattleya, it was 72 degrees. So just having it a little bit lower in a tray of gravel with water in the tray, I reduced the temperature, it's like, 16 degrees. I was amazed. And then I took a look at the root zones. And if you look at the actual clay pot, which is constantly moist, and every day I have to add a little bit of rainwater to the gravel trays, it's constantly transpiring water in my greenhouse. And so water goes from the tray up into the clay pot, evaporates, and the Mazda in the net pot stays moist but not soggy, and the root zone is 69 degrees. Remember, the Cattleya a foot and a half above is 88 degrees. So I can actually grow, and you can see on the right, hybrid Mazda, and this one comes from Equigenera in Ecuador, and they've got a great website. This is one of their hybrids that's not described as cool growing, but described as intermediate. And I actually can grow Mazda hybrids in my greenhouse, even though I'm not in coastal California. So for some of you who think you're a little too warm and maybe you'd like to grow some of these cooler, high Andean orchids that people along the coast can grow, here's a method where you might be able to get by. And believe it or not, these orchids survived even though the air temperature briefly in the greenhouse was 107, because their little microclimate zone where I've got this set up, they were able to tolerate the temperatures and stay cooler. So that's warm summer months. Now let's take a look at the other extreme. February 23rd, 2023, at 1,600 foot altitude, Templeton, California, we had 2 days where we had snow. It's probably the first time in 10 to 20 years we had a dusting of snow. But my wife and I woke up, and our dog Willow looked out, and everything was blanketed in white. These are Dendrobium speciosums, which are related to or similar to Dendrobium kingianum, but these get much, much larger. And you'd think, oh my gosh, you kept these outside, these are dead. Well, lo and behold, here we are, April 25th, so that's February, March, April, 2 months later, they all bloomed. One of them had a little bit of tip damage on one of the bloom spikes, but Dendrobium speciosum, in addition to kingianum, are super tough orchids. If you got a few days where you get frost, a few days where you get temperatures in the hundreds, Dendrobium speciosum will do fine. If you have afternoon, really, really bright sun, you're going to want to put them under a lath house or a shade area, under the eaves of a house. If you have times when it gets to freezing and below for extended periods of time, if you live north of the rhododendron line, and you get snow 2 feet high, you're not going to be able to grow it outdoors. But if you have relatively mild winter conditions with maybe occasional frost, Dendrobium speciosum will take it. And another trick, I'm very close to the Paso Robles wine growing area, midway between Los Angeles and San Francisco. A number of tasting rooms throw out their bottles every Monday or Tuesday after they do weekend tastings. So I got the idea, I need thermal mass in my greenhouse, something that will absorb heat during the day, give it off at night, keep my temperature fluctuations minimal. So I went out and collected wine bottles from some very generous wineries in the area, and I have 2,500 wine bottles under the benches in my greenhouse. And you have to remember, when liquid water, when the molecules start to slow down and hydrogen bonding allows them to link together to form ice, that process of slowing down and giving off heat to turn from liquid water to ice releases 80 calories per gram of water. Well, a wine bottle, 750 milliliters, will release 60,000 calories of heat as it turns from liquid water to solid ice. And so here's a thermal reservoir that during the day is picking up heat, and then at night when it cools down, if your temperatures outdoors are very, very cold, in order for the water mass in those wine bottles to get to freezing, they've got to give up a huge amount of heat. That heat goes into your greenhouse or around your plants if you're surrounding outdoor plants with water bottles. That's going to protect your plants or your growing zone from ever getting to freezing conditions. So as much as my lowest temperature was 38 degrees, it was probably something like 17 degrees outside at the time. So this thermal mass works extremely well. Other strategies you can use, heating pads, seed starting mats, plug them in, put your sensitive orchids on those, and they do a fantastic job, particularly keeping the root zone warm. I also have plug-in space heaters, and I'm going to use an electric space heater that's oil-filled. It looks like a little portable radiator, and I'm going to put that into my greenhouse this January and February, see if I can boost that minimum temperature up to at least 40, 42, so that some of my more temperature-sensitive cattleyas don't do as poorly as they have in the past. You can use old-fashioned incandescent twinkle lights. Sadly, the move to LED lights don't give off very much heat, but the old-fashioned twinkle lights work well. You can also use blankets, towels, bell jars, roll covers. They all create an insulating blanket of air over your plants for the occasional cold night. Again, you can crowd your plants together, create a little more of a warm zone. And then the last one I want to explore in a little more details. This came out of an article I read in the American Orchid Society bulletin about a grower that was using heated water in the winter. And I got the idea, well, under one of my benches, I could throw a trash can, put an aquarium heater in it, and use that as a portable heater. So what I've done is I've taken a trash can, a standard aquarium heater, suitable for whatever volume trash can you have. I think this is the 30-gallon trash can. And then you can get a rechargeable misting wand that you can put one end into the trash can. You press the little button and you've got, on one charge, 30 hours of watering capability. So not only does this warmed trash can, and I keep mine at about 66 degrees Fahrenheit, I think this winter I'll boost it up to 70. So you've got this 70-degree pool of water, maybe underneath one of your benches, that's serving as somewhat of a radiator to warm up your temperatures in your greenhouse or your growing area. And now in the morning, and this was recommended by Dr. Martin Moats of Moats Orchids in Florida. He mentioned in Florida on a cold winter morning, you can go out and if you've got warm water, you can spray your vandas with warm water and it brings them up to temperature very quickly. So as the day warms up, your orchids aren't starting out at a deficit with low temperatures. And I just water most of my orchids on sunny, cold winter mornings with this warm water. And then I just take my hose in my greenhouse, refill the trash can for the water volume that I've used, and it serves as a perpetual warm water reservoir for my orchids. And it's worked out really, really well. And then again, I have to emphasize, if it's going to be a foggy, cold nasty day, don't water your orchids in the morning. They need to dry out during the day because in the winter, the idea is to keep your orchids much, much drier than you would during the spring and summer. Dry orchids can get through much colder temperatures. If the root zone is wet, the old adage that we all say in the Five Cities Orchid Society is cold and wet equals dead. And keeping your orchids drier in the winter, one of the helpful recommendations I received early on has done wonders for helping my orchids, particularly things like oncidiums. Keep the pot small and keep the root zone dry in the winter, and they will do much, much better. Okay, so now we know what our minimum, maximum summer, winter temperatures are. We know what our light levels are. We're going to use misting systems or other methods to increase the humidity. I pretty well defined what my growing conditions are. If it's a windowsill, I know it's facing north. I know what the temperatures are in my house. How do I pick what orchids to grow? Well, one of the easiest, best ways is to join a local orchid society and see what others in your area are growing. I was amazed when I joined Five Cities Orchid Society. I had no idea some of these orchids could be grown in this area. When I lived down in Southern California, I was in Claremont, and Norman's Orchids right over in Montclair. Even though they were greenhouses, it showed me the huge range of orchids that were possible growing just 10 miles from my house. And that instantly created the desire for me to have a greenhouse. The other thing you can do is ask vendors for recommendations. When you go to an orchid show, I know a lot of first-time orchid growers are very intimidated. You can't remember what the names of orchids are. You can't remember which is a Phalaenopsis, which is a Paphiopedilum. Get over your fear. Ask the questions. You now know what your conditions are. Most growers are going to be more than happy to make recommendations of what are easy growing orchids, orchids for first-time growers, or even more advanced orchids that are more of a specialist orchid. If you're a more advanced grower, they're more than happy to recommend orchids for your growing conditions. And then lastly, you can search websites like Equigenera, and equigenera.com has a wonderful feature if you go to their main website that you can plug in your growing conditions, cool, intermediate, or warm, and it will then sort among genus for what orchids are recommended for your type of conditions, particularly temperature. And it's helped me find the Masdevallia hybrids that would grow in my warmer conditions where most Masdevallias can't take temperatures much above 70, 75. So that's been very, very useful. And a number of orchid websites will help you in selecting orchids for your particular conditions. And I just wanted to give some examples of what I've been able to grow. And when I moved up again to Templeton now, 13 years ago, I had no idea Laelia anceps could grow outside along the coast and in my sheltered locations. So thanks to Wayne Farrell at the Santa Barbara Orchid Estate 13 years ago, for saying, not only can you grow Laelia anceps, it'll be in a sheltered location or in your greenhouse, but Cattleya persivaliana, one of the more cool-tolerant Cattleyas, can take warmer temperatures, but it's just fantastic. Both of them grew really well for me, and I went back the next year and he said, we do have a hybrid that's Laelia anceps crossed with Cattleya persivaliana called Cattleya or LC Caligula. And boy, it sent up, I think, 6 spikes last year for me with 3 or 4 flowers on each spike. And so once you find species that do well, you can then look at hybrids using one or more of those species. And if the species grows well, the hybrids will probably also grow. And so that's how I built out my collection. I bought one small plant of Laelia Cattleya Trick or Treat from Tropic Orchid Farm in Maui 30 years ago. It was just introduced at the time, and I believe the owner, his name was Jim, he said, well, if you're going to try to grow outside in Southern California, you get some kind of cool winter conditions, try Trick or Treat. And it was the first Cattleya I ever got to rebloom. I'm so proud of the fact that, wow, I didn't kill this one. I actually got it to rebloom the next year. So Trick or Treat's always been a favorite. And Sunset Valley Orchids has taken Trick or Treat and developed a number of hybrids using that as one of the parents. And so Red Dawn, a red star, crossed with Trick or Treat. I bought a flask of seedlings, and they've ranged from solid orange to orange sepals with red lips to solid red. And I've got them growing all over my greenhouse. So once you find, again, an orchid that grows well under your conditions, you might want to go out and try to find other orchids that are hybrids that have that plant as one of the parents. And you're probably going to be successful with the offspring of the hybrids as well. And then another example is EPC, which is an epidendron crossed with a cattleya, Kayaguchi. Fred Clark, Sunset Valley Orchids, has a huge range of these hybrids that he's developed. I've bought flasks and I've bought individual plants. And this just shows you the range of colors possible once you find an orchid that grows well in your Goldilocks conditions. So the benefit of Kayaguchi is it's got a real spicy fragrance as well. And as the plants get older and older, the spikes have more and more flowers. So I've seen mature plants that are probably 10 years old that have maybe 5 or 6 spikes with 20 flowers on each spike. Just spectacular plants. And I do have to remind particularly our 5 Cities Orchid Society members that are in Napomo and Cayucas, all the way up to Cambria, down to San Luis Obispo. We're in a unique part of the world where we have temperatures that never go below freezing in the winter. The summer, because of the coastal influence and coastal fogs, we rarely get above 80. And there's a huge range of orchids that grow in the Andes Mountains in Central and South America for the Andes, but also in higher mountainous areas in Central America that are cold growing orchids. And boy, if you don't take advantage, particularly on the upper right, odontoglossums, fantastic plants. There aren't that many people in the country that can grow these cold growing orchids. But if you're in an area where you can, or if you've got indoor controlled conditions, by all means, take advantage of growing these. And by far, most of these plants shown here are grown by Chris Erler, Grover Beach, California. And he's just got a fantastic collection. It's just wonderful to go see what he's growing. I also mentioned lifestyle as one of the issues we need to deal with for the Goldilocks conditions, because if you're going to travel and you're not there to water your orchids every few days in the summer, you're going to come back home from a trip, and unless you got a lot of good friends that are willing to come by and take care of orchids for you, you're going to come back to dead or sorry-looking orchids. So a couple strategies you can employ is there are a number of dendrobiums that grow in the Himalayas, northern India, and Southeast Asia, northern parts in the mountains, that go completely dormant in the winter. So during the summer, the monsoons hit, they're just drenched with 30 inches a month of rain, humid, hot conditions, and Dendrobium fimbriatum on the left. But starting at around starting around November at Thanksgiving, you can stop watering these orchids, and they're known as dry winter rest orchids. And you don't need to do anything to take care of them. I have mine mounted on oak branches, and maybe once a week I'll hit them with a little bit of mist just so they don't desiccate completely. And once you get to Valentine's Day, middle of February, you start watering them, and about 2 to 3 months later, you're rewarded with just fantastic sprays of flowers. So the dry winter rest dendrobiums are great if you go away in the wintertime and you don't have time to care for your orchids. Another technique that our society president, Jeff Parham, really likes is semi-hydroponics. That's a clear plastic container, about 1 inch up from the bottom. There's a little hole drilled into it, so there's about 1 inch of water that resides in the bottom of the container. And this is probably either a brassia or odontoglossum. And the brown marbles in there are a product called Leca lightweight expanded clay aggregate. Sometimes it goes by the name of Hydroton, Hydroton. And the water in the bottom wicks up through the spaces between the clay marbles and keeps the root zone moist. but it allows oxygen and air to penetrate in those spaces. And so the roots are constantly moist, but they constantly have a supply of oxygen. So they don't become waterlogged. And it's a great way every, few weeks, you just have to top up the water as it evaporates or if the plant absorbs it. And you grow semi-hydroponically. Paphiopedilums also benefit. Those are the slipper orchids. And then on the right, I'm growing in sphagnum moss, and this is a fairly exotic orchid, Cousithania pendulata, which came from Marty Turkle up in the Santa Rosa area. But I want to point out the pseudobulb, that large swelling where the leaves are growing out of it. That is a water storage orchid. And so that's your safeguard when you go away for a week and you can't water your orchids. That's going to provide moisture to your orchid and nutrients to your orchid. So think of orchids that have these swollen pseudobulbs at the base of the leaves as water storage organs. And if your lifestyle doesn't permit you to maintain and tend to your orchids every day, every 2 days, choose orchids like cymbidiums or this Cousithania that have large pseudobulbs. And you'll be able to get by with looking at your orchids maybe every week to 2 weeks instead of every day. And now, again, I want to promote the idea. I was not a big joiner of organizations, but the benefits I've reaped from joining the local Orchid Society, in this case, 5 Cities Orchid Society, has just been fantastic. And I want to share with you some of the recommendations that I found extremely useful over the last 12 years. Eric Kalenda did a great talk on the dancing lady orchids on Oncidiums. That's the twinkle that I talked about earlier. And he mentioned the smallest pot to contain the root ball is what you want to look for. Now, if you're used to growing house plants or garden plants, sometimes the bigger pot, bigger container, wow, I'm treating my plants really well, I'm giving them room to grow. Well, in orchids, what that does is it means the center of the root mass in a very large pot stays damp or soggy all the time. And that causes the roots to rot. That rot extends out or extends up into the pseudobulbs, and you kill your orchid. So what you want is the smallest pot possible, even a net pot with a lot of good slots in it so that air can get in. It will dry out thoroughly. And then when you water it thoroughly, wet it completely. But the smallest pot possible has really made a difference in my growing odontoglossum orchids. And so thanks to Eric for that recommendation. Julie Walter introduced me to those little brown marble clay pellets, Leca hydroton. She grows all of her cattleyas in, I think this is tenebrosa or a hybrid of tenebrosa. The nice thing is, unlike bark, it doesn't break down. So if you've got an orchid that doesn't like disturbances, and bifoliate cattleyas, which are cattleyas which have 2 flowers coming out of the 2 leaves coming out of the pseudobulb, are particularly sensitive to repotting. Those grow great in hydroton, and you can leave them in the pot with the hydroton until they outgrow the pot. You don't need to repot because the media has broken down. So thanks to Julie for that recommendation. And then I do want to give accolades to my good friend Clive Gray, who said, we spend all this time going to Orchid Society meetings and listening to people and whatnot, but you really just need to sit back at times and enjoy your orchid collection. And so oftentimes when you're futzing around and looking for what's not growing well and figuring out what the problems are, we miss the opportunity to just sit back, enjoy your orchids, and enjoy the success you've had in growing them. So thanks to Clive for a great reminder that it's important to enjoy what the fruits of all your labor are, and that's blooming orchids, particularly if they've got a fantastic scent. And then Bob Asbell, who owned Asbell Orchids. Sadly, Bob's no longer with us. Dan has sold the business, so they're no longer in business. But they were outdoor growers under a lath house in Arroyo Grande, California. And they exposed me to a range of orchids I had no idea existed, let alone could be grown in this area. On the left, we have Arpaphyllum, a candlestick type of orchid. Just a fantastic plant. I'd never seen it before. Lycastes. This one, Lycaste odorata, has the wonderful scent of cinnamon. and it will grow well in our coastal conditions. I'm growing several plants in my greenhouse in shady locations. They have those big flat leaves, so we know they like low light conditions. And then here's a dendrobium. I believe that's an aggregatum or a hybrid, but it's one that requires a dry winter rest, and just a fantastic plant. Look at the number of flowers on the spikes. And again, Dan, expert grower, introduced me to that whole class of orchids I hadn't known about. And then living in Claremont, being close to Norman's orchids, Norman one day took me aside and said, you know, I just found this stuff called neem oil. It's from the seeds of the neem tree. I believe it's grown in India. They press it, and where you can spray a dormant oil on your rose bushes and fruit trees to smother insects, particularly when they're dormant. Neem oil has got properties that make it a fungicide. It will smother insects, particularly eggs and nymphs, just like a dormant oil will. It smells somewhat minty, at least to my nose, fairly low toxicity. And it's important that you mix it at the proper ratio. So this one I've got labeled as half a tablespoon per quart. I put it in my quart solo sprayer. It is an oil that doesn't emulsify too easily, so I put a few drops of Dawn dish detergent in to work as an emulsifier, and that helps to wet out, particularly if you have waxy scale insects. It wets out, helps penetrate the scale, also wets out the leaf surfaces. But again, as a dormant oil, you got to be careful. You don't want to spray it at concentrations that are too high. You want to test it on some of your orchids to make sure they're not overly sensitive. And you don't want to spray on a day where the temperatures can get really hot, because the oil is going to sit on the surface of your leaves, and it can burn the orchids, it can dehydrate them. So you want to use it sparingly, cool mornings, and you're going to have to spray probably every 10 days because it will not, if you're trying to control scale, it will not kill the eggs under the mature scale insects. So you got to wait for them to hatch, which is like a 7 to 10 day cycle. If you spray 3 times every 10 days, you'll probably catch most of the scale nymphs that are coming out. Another issue with scale, and you can see on the right, those little white pock marks are developing scale insects. Those are the females. The males tend to cluster in clumps, and they look white and fuzzy, almost cottony. This works well to control scale by just dipping a toothbrush into 70% isopropanol rubbing alcohol. And I've read the warnings, don't use other alcohols, ethanol, methanol. They will penetrate the leaves and probably cause collapse of the surface cells of your plant leaves. And I just scrub whenever I see any scale, and does a good job of removing existing scale. You got to really look in the folds of pseudobulbs. You've got to look at the leaf sheath or the flower sheaths on the leaves where they join the bulbs. Great hiding place for scale. But thanks to Eric, I've become now a leaf scrubber. And then as the benefit of this presentation, a few of the questions after the time I gave this talk live, a number of our members recommended adding Formula 409 cleaner to the mixture of 1/3 water, 1/3 409, 1/3 70% rubbing alcohol. And the 409 contains quaternary alkyl benzyl ammonium compounds that act as fungicides. They're similar to the compounds in Physan, which some of you may spray or drench your orchids in as a fungicide and a winter preventative for your orchids. It also kills algae. But this particular combination of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 has been recommended to me. I'm going to start trying it in the near future as a way of more effectively controlling scale by dipping a toothbrush or paintbrush in and then scrubbing your leaf surfaces. And then I want to give accolades to Rudy of Five Cities Orchid Society. He was the owner of Slow Orchids in Arroyo Grande. And 14 years ago, I met him for the first time. I bought a Tolumia from him, which is a very small type of Ancidium, the dancing lady orchids, that requires drying out in between waterings and warmer temperatures. And his recommendation was, you should really join Five Cities Orchid Society. They're really a great bunch. And I got to say, he was right. It's been a very, very valuable learning experience for me in being part of Five Cities Orchid Society. I've learned a tremendous amount, and I hope through this presentation you've been able to benefit by my 40 years of growing orchids, making a very, very large number of mistakes, and getting some great recommendations from good friends, orchid vendors, websites, and most importantly, members of my local orchid society. So I just want to say thank you to fellow Five Cities Orchid Society members for helping me to become a better orchid grower. And this is just an example of some of the things I'm growing in my greenhouse that 14 years ago I would have never imagined blooming. On the left you have a Cattleya suavis developed by Andy Easton, just a fantastic Cattleya. Paphiopedilum gloria noggle, which has only bloomed once for me, but the blooms lasted for about 5 months. And it's a Paphiopedilum slipper orchid, and I'm hoping to get it to bloom again in the near future. And then on the right is a Vanda, Patchung Stellite. Dendrobium aggregatum is the orange guy, and then the yellow is an Oncidium. Can't remember the variety right now, but all are growing well in my greenhouse thanks to the recommendations of Five Cities Orchid Society members. And this is a close-up of the Vanda. Just a fabulous orchid. Can take, as you see, 38 degrees in the winter, 107 in the summer, and it does well. It's a hybrid of Vanda cerulean, which grows in the Andes it grows in the Andes Mountains. It grows in the Southeast Asian mountainous areas and can actually take frost. So hybrids of it can do extremely well in a range of conditions. So if you enjoy orchid discussions like this one, you're invited to subscribe to the Five Cities Orchid Society newsletter, and we've got an excellent website, www.fcos.org. And if you subscribe to the newsletter, every month you'll receive a Zoom link, and you can join our Zoom presentations. And we have presenters from all over the globe presenting on a number of orchid topics, for novice growers to advanced growers. So again, thank you very much for your participation in this seminar, and I hope to see you in the future.